Hello, good morning. Another update from what we are now calling the digital underground. So, I think it's appropriate from a lot of different points of view. My name is Juan Valdez. I am your host or your guide in the digital underground. As many of you know, if you're familiar with some of my work, I'm an author, I'm a writer, I'm also a computer scientist, and I deal with technology and systems generally professionally. Uh, and I started a journal and I started writing around 10 or 15 years ago uh, to explore certain ideas. I have to be careful, I'm working on the volume here and the feedback. So you may have to turn this up a little bit, which is good because we'll whisper, because some of these things are worth whispering. And we've done a bit of a rebranding, so we're no longer Snow Cone Diaries, even though that was the title of my first work. We are now Notes from the Digital Underground, and the site has been rebranded. I've got a couple of books that just came out. Homo Mysticus, which was written two years ago. Ex Machina, which is a sort of a trip of sorts into some of my background and into some what you might call kind of mystical landscapes, taking reading some ancient texts and sacred geometry. That book just came out by Dorrance Publishing. You can see that on my site. And the other one is Metaphysics Reconsidered, which is a Gnostic reading of Kant, where I really make the argument that Kant is at heart, philosophically, completely aligned with mysticism and some of the ancient Eastern traditions in particular. And there's a Western esoteric tradition too, with Hermeticism and sort of New Age stuff too, which is very much aligned. But those roots are really pseudo-Eastern, I guess you could say. I kind of trace it all back in my original work, Theology Reconsidered. So my work is, in a nutshell, I did research into theology, which I wrote a piece, Theology Reconsidered, and then my next work was Metaphysics Reconsidered. And the most of the foray right now is really Physics Reconsidered, is redefining physics. And in doing so, really what I'm expounding on is really this area of metaphysics, which has a long history throughout Aristotle in the Western tradition, but is sort of baked into the sort of mystical and spiritual traditions from the East. But it's the same discipline. And this is primarily where I've written, and as a computer scientist, that's really where I study from an engineering standpoint, is if you were to create a ideological system, a system of metaphysics, what would it look like? And it would fundamentally, that's not a hypothetical question. That's what we're doing right now with software and robotics and AI, and that's what I'm studying. So I have an undergraduate from Brown in economics and ancient studies. I have a master's in computer science from New York University, and I'm currently pursuing a PhD in computer science at Florida Atlantic University. So it's, but all very much aligned with this work, Notes from the Digital Underground. My feedback to you, Notes from the Digital Underground. Hopefully some of this messaging gets to some people that need to hear it, and you get a sense of what it is that I'm experiencing and how that sort of aligns with your own experience, and why these types of dialogue become important in taking us to sort of the next stage of human existence, which is where we're headed, whether we like it or not. So before everybody gets up, I'm in Providence. I'm at my which is where I went to college, and my son is here, and he's been having some sort of entry issues. He's a transfer, and health and wellness Let's start there. I also have another friend of mine, very close friend of mine, who spent a couple of months in a mental hospital, and I was part of the team that got him discharged. And um, and what's occurred to me while I've been up here in Providence, helping with some of that work, without getting into detail about it for privacy reasons, um, it's it's become clear that at the individual level, there's a level of anxiety that people have now that is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It permeates everyone in all walks of life. The anxiety is palpable now, right? So you have individual situations and circumstances, right? But as I lay out in Homo Mysticus, there's sort of 7 spheres of existence, right? There's the individual level, and I drew a diagram here, which you probably can't see, but I'll show it to you anyway. There you go. There you go. 7 spheres. You can see the individual at the beginning, right in the center, the corner, right, the point, right, the center of consciousness. Then you have family, and then community, and then beyond that you have sort of nation, globe, planet, and the universe, right? So those are sort of spheres or layers of existence, but they're actually beings or entities that are represented. This is this whole idea of collective unconscious that Jung really introduced to us, or we were introduced to it through Jung. And this whole idea of the mythical consciousness and sort of these archetypical themes. And this is all a collective being that we are in fact tapped into, right? I mean, this is what Jung was describing and exploring. Anybody who's done meditation, who's practiced for a long time, understands that you start to get exposed to and have experience with these other different dimensions, literally dimensions of being, right? And so much of what I'm going to talk about now for a couple of minutes is going to be under the banner of this Ascension update, and some of it's understanding it a little bit better as it relates to both what's happening individually, your community, your nation, the globe, the world, society, and in turn, the universe, because all those dimensions are changing at the same time, in sort of a very rapid way, which is how I sort of got here and how many of us got here, right? All my brothers and sisters, if you're, helping people get from, manage through this ascension in whatever way you can, Godspeed to you guys, because this is difficult work. So at an individual level, right? So what you see just in terms of data, right, is people are having anxiety, there's depression, there's anxiety attacks, there's people in mental institute, there's the homeless, and it's this whole sort of, you look at the gun epidemic in America, right? It's like, well, it's not the gun, it's the person who's pulling the trigger. And if someone has mental illness is a radical disease of the West right now. The family structure is broken down. As of Nietzsche, God is dead, right? I mean, it's like there's no end to what we will do in the name of one ideology or another, right? And so everybody's feeling this anxiety, and the question is, well, why? What's going on, right? Why is everybody so anxious? Well, there's all this instability and change, and then there's the pandemic, which made it worse, right? Well, but you have to be careful with cause and effect here. And this is one of Jungian's ideas around synchronicity. Things sort of manifest collectively, and there's different layers of interrelated, whether it's causation or correlation, that bring events together in a synchronous fashion, right? That's a fundamental psychological principle, right? And you see it in your own life if you open your eyes to it. And so as the consciousness shifts of our reality, of the planet, right, as it sort of gets more fine, you can feel it. There are physical symptoms. And those physical symptoms make people uncomfortable because they don't necessarily fit into the mindset that we've been given to help us cope through reality, right? It's not, what I call it is, objective realism. It's the opposite of that. It's psychic realism, right? Not to the exclusion or the detriment of material or objective, realism, but their reality exists along these dimensions, and it's true in all these dimensions. Whether you're talking about the dream landscape and the astral body, or you talk about sort of the sort of causal body, which is this sort of higher self, which has a relationship to the physical form and into your mind and your psyche, and that's a real thing. If you want to ignore that, you go ahead, but there's going to be consequences, and they will show up in your physical reality as challenges, right? So let's talk about physical symptoms, right? Anxiety, headaches, can't sleep, right? High blood pressure, right? These are all things that come from this fight or flight mechanism that kicks in when the body sees something it doesn't know. It feels like it's in danger. They are happening naturally as consciousness rises. Our nervous systems are having to adapt. And particularly if we don't have the social structures or the support structures sociologically or economically to support that transition, that's where there's tension. And that tension causes the body to not feel right. Okay? So now it turns out these radical shifts are also tremendous opportunities of spiritual growth if you have the right mindset and you have the right training. This is what in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition they call Bardo. Death is the great moment of Bardo, of potential spiritual awakening, because there's such a radical shift occurring. What happens is the old is torn away, and there's a new sort of framework or new energetic level that's stabilized. It's the way quantum mechanics works, where you have energies and electrons that shift between various states, but they shift rapidly and suddenly, almost immediately. And it's not a continuous shift. This is what Planck discovered with the quanta, right? There are these sort of quantum leaps of energetic states at that level. Same thing happens psychically, right? It's sort of you shift quick, and during that shifting, what happens is there's a window that opens to higher dimensions, because it's just raw energy that you're just running on the back of. And that's why the nervous system freaks out and self-defense mechanisms kick in, and that's why everybody's running around medicated, because the Western medicine, that's all it knows, and everything's a chemical reaction, so it just loads you up with chemicals that may or may not help, depending on the situation. You got to be careful with that stuff. I've had my own bouts with it, I can tell you that. So that's at the individual level, but okay, nice theory, right? But look at what's happening in society at large, in the economy, and geopolitics, right? So if you look at it from that lens, there's some windows of understanding that open up on all these other levels, which are the 7 spheres that I laid out. And this inflation that we're challenged with right now, and this sort of, there's been a big walkout work-wise, and sort of this whole kind of professional and economic landscape is shifting, and global supply chains are shifting, and what people want to buy and are interested in is shifting, and where they want to spend their money and their time, it's all shifting. People are moving. The whole world is shifting, right? And inflation is less, it's obviously gas prices, right? But gas prices are going up because of supply chain and logistic issues, primarily because Russia's now taken itself out of the Western market. And this anxiety and this fear-based mindset, which is what kicks in, right, when you're exposed to something, great change, and a sense of, to the unknown, effectively. Putin is clearly acting out of great fear. I mean, he's been very plain about this if you listen to him. Putin is a reasonable guy, but he feels as if he's defending Russia and the encroachment of the West, of NATO, onto his borders, right? And he's reacting out of fear. And it's the same impetus that drives an anxiety attack, right? Because when you have an anxiety attack, you don't know how to act, and if you're a dog and you're cornered, you're gonna lash out, right? I mean, that's self-defense kicks in, right? Those are different sort of neurological systems, very old neurological systems to protect and survive. And that's what's really driving him, right? And much of it was pandemic based. You have this sort of nationalist movement from which Trump emerged, right? This sort of self-defense, withdrawing in to protect oneself and what you think is from against, the unknown, or immigration, or whatever it is, right? Fear. And some politicians tap into this, as they would, but the fear is real, right? You can't deny it, and it drives a lot of geopolitical behavior, as you see, and that in turn drives logistics, and that has impacts on the economy as a whole, as certain sources of food have dried up in Eastern Europe, and the gas pipeline over there has been shut down, and that's affected the whole market here. And the service industry has been blown up, really, in the West, at least certainly in the States, because people just don't want to deal anymore. So that's affected wages and labor supply chain, and prices have almost doubled as a consumer here in the West, certainly in the U.S. And the idea that you're going to raise interest rates and that's somehow going to fix it, it's not. But it probably needs to be raised anyway. But the Fed certainly doesn't have a lot of leverage right now, given how interconnected everything is. It's a tough job. So anyway, but I wanted individuals to understand that as I become to, as my eyes open up to a higher level of awareness and understanding as to what the hell is going on and what the hell we're doing here, I'm trying to share some of that. Notes from the digital underground, right? So what you want to do is you want to take care of yourself as best as you can. If you're having anxiety attacks or headaches, whatever, it's telling you something. You have to sort of, take a breath, stop, commune with your surroundings, and sort of, try and find a higher level of awareness that you can settle into, because from that level, some of the other symptoms will fall away. But it's a process. And obviously, if you're having serious issues, you should see a medical professional. I'm not a doctor. Okay. So that sort of gives you a sense as to what, geopolitically and economically and sort of psychically what is happening right now. So yes, it's real. It's happening. The whole globe is shifting to a higher level of awareness and consciousness. And what's happening is the socio-economic and geopolitical structures are having to shift around to support that. So there's a little bit of, tugging that's going on. I do believe, as many have said in the community, the spiritual community, that most of the really terrible scenarios we've avoided. So I think we're in pretty good shape. I think they're going to figure shit out in Eastern Europe eventually. And I think things are going to stabilize. And I think there's going to be lots of new opportunities to make a living in this sort of new, world where everybody can sort of have their own perspective and market it and, leverage their skills. And I think it'll be, in many respects, a world of plenty. So I've talked a little bit about the 7 spheres. Talked a little bit about mental wellness, some of the anxiety attacks, talked about the Ukraine conflict. Anyway, I talked about the fear. And the fear is a natural reaction of the nervous system, right? That's what people need to understand. And this is part of the point that I make in Homo Mysticus and Ex Machina, right? Is that I believe we've been engineered by a higher order level of being. And I believe we've been sort of consciousness has been injected into this biochemical, neurological structure of which we are, which is some miracle of all miracles, right? And I believe that the system itself, the simulation that we're in, is just so amazing that you can't tell the difference. And it's really difficult to break free. This is the old concept of Maya, or illusion, in Indian philosophy, right? It's the veil. Is that in the dark of night, you can't see the difference between the rope and the snake. Okay? It's very disconcerting when you follow it till its end. It's very disconcerting. But there's a really strong chance that the Matrix is true. I mean, it's a dramatization, it's a movie, whatever, but like, now you get windows into this, whether you do hallucinogenics or whether it's in the dream state or in deep meditation or an intuition, which is your thread from the higher self into this self, right? That you have a constant thread, and your higher self is always available to you. You can speak to it. It's there. It's your conscious, right? It's real. But you have to believe that it's real. We've been taught that it's an illusion, right? It's not. It's not. In many ways, it's more real. It is the cause to which we are the effect. And of course, this has all sort of implications from a metaphysics standpoint, which is what I wrote about in my last paper, IRA, the ideological reference architecture, which talks about quantum measurement theory as a sort of epistemic model, right, in terms of how knowledge is acquired through this experience, using sort of a Kantian mindset, and then quantum measurement theory, which underpins quantum mechanics, where there's sort of a potential state through which measurement sort of drives actualization, right? That's basically what it is, right? And ultimately, knowledge acquisition follows that process, right? There's an element of will, there's an element of a potential state, given all sorts of constraints and parameters, and then you sort of navigate through that intellectual landscape. But there is a very symbiotic, close relationship between what's on the outside and on the inside, both in terms of how we interpret it and in turn of how it is ultimately created, right? And that's the great mystery of mysteries that they've been hiding from us all these millennia, but that they've talked about in all the mystic traditions for millennia, and has sort of been codified into these religious doctrines. But underlying them is a fundamental mystical truth, which they've been teaching since the dawn of man, whenever that was. So I have 2 books that came out. Check out my website. They're both there if you want to get into sort of the meat of this. My current areas of research are artificial intelligence. I'm taking a course right now on the underlying mathematics and geometrical structures through which, machines can learn effectively. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, right? It's the same thing, more or less. Different aspects of the same thing. And there's some mathematical principles that underpin how these systems gain information and, have predictive power, so to speak, which is what primarily machine learning is designed for, to predict outcomes, right? This is in some way sort of intelligence, right? Beyond just being able to perform functional tasks, which historically is what computing has done. So I'm also studying linear algebra, calculus, a little bit of discrete math, networks and graph theory, and different data structures, and fundamentally information, where my dissertation will go, I don't know. It's going to take me a couple years to get through this program because I'm only doing it part-time. I am working on a paper at the same time around meaning, natural language processing. What does that mean what are the underlying data structures and algorithms through which, via language, we can, articulate meaning in whatever manner we can from a computer science standpoint. So that's a paper that I'm also starting to look at and doing research on. All mostly in this sort of realm of metaphysics and the engineering bent of metaphysics, which is computer science, more or less. And so, as I come to an end, right, I'll go back to the beginning. So my first book, Snow Cone Diaries, which was written out of, I know it was written since college, but it was I was driven through emotional turmoil, you could say, to put pen to paper and to use it as sort of a cathartic, hey, this is what happened. And, I created an identity and started to write, tried to write fiction. I wasn't very good at it, but I did at least document the Charlie's journey, so to speak. And the opening chapter of that, and I don't have the book with me because I'm not in my library right now, but it's on the cover of Snow Cone Diaries. It's a bridge that's being constructed. So the opening chapter, and I can still remember the dream very vividly. I mean, this is where people say they have visions, right? I mean, if it's 20 years later and I can still remember it, right? I mean, is that a vision or is that a dream? You tell me, right? So I'm on this bridge, and it's a bridge into nowhere. It's like the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. It's like foggy and and I'm afraid of heights. So like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing up there. And we're building and sort of constructing the bridge. There's a bunch of us there, like, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen, in different layers and parts of the bridge. Okay? But we're like right on the edge, man, like moving the wood onto scaffolding and like right on the edge. There's no one in front of us. Which is terrifying, right? It's probably why I woke up. And that's the cover. The cover is the construction of the Manhattan Bridge, and I think it's the 1920s or something like that. And you could see the way that they build bridges, or at least they did in my mind, was consistent with the way that they built the Manhattan Bridge. And clearly there is a group of people, and Dolores Cannon talks about these 3 waves, right, that have arrived here to build the bridge from the old world into the new. And that's the consciousness shift, right? Many in the spiritual communities especially are sort of dipping out. A lot of people are quitting and doing their own thing, or they're just dipping out. It's like, okay, Godspeed, right? Create these new modes and ways of being, right? But at the same time, there needs to be, an infrastructure in place, socio-economic, logistic, supply chain, to feed people, just fundamentally, right? That requires people to run and manage these systems and to work in delis and groceries, to drive trucks, right? To fly planes. And the companies that sell the services and goods to facilitate that, like they all have to come along, right? And so I work for a very big company in the insurance industry, and I'm on the benefits side of that business. But that has its own challenges. There's value we bring to the marketplace to help people feel better and get benefits that are fundamentally instrumental to their well-being, that they can in turn take advantage of because they work for a company, right? Companies are, in many respects, the big companies too, they're the bedrock of, Western economy. It's not just this evil empire. They're providing goods and services into the market that allow people to live good and meaningful lives. So there's that aspect of it, and that's just day to day, right? What do your interrelationships work like? I'm constantly challenged with that. And the other aspect is bringing the academic, intellectual community along, which is important because as the younger generations get trained and as they learn things, they need to be exposed to some of these principles so that they're prepared for what life brings them. Right now, there is no spiritual education, no religious education, no metaphysics or mystical education to any of these kids. It's been driven out of the schools because it all fell under the banner of religion. And so you toss the baby out with the bathwater, and now these kids are running around catatonic because they got no frame of reference. Their friends, Instagram, whatever, and then they freak out and they jump off a bridge. How can you blame them? But there's an intellectual look that these universities have a responsibility and an obligation to bring people along. They now are mostly, particularly the higher end universities, are engaged in sort of this woke kind of radical leftist ideology, which, it comes from a good place, right? Everything should be equal, everybody should be treated equal, everything. But it's, at the same time, um, it needs an inflection or an inflection of, conservative ideals as well to maintain the structure. Robert Pirsig talks about this well. You have sort of static and dynamic quality elements from which societies and complex structures evolve, right? You have static elements that allow it to retain its structure, that are averse to change. And then you have dynamic sort of bursts of awareness, right? And understanding, gnosis, really, that inject itself into the system. Whether it's Christ or Buddha, right? That's sort of a dynamic element that comes and blows up the static element, and then it restructures, right? I mean, that's what's going on right now in the Western mind, in Western culture, and in the East too. But it's a different flavor over there. And I'll probably close on this, right? So how do you deal with day to day? Again, you meditate, drink a lot of water, try and get sleep, eat light, obviously, and of course I'm doing like half of these myself, but take it with a grain of salt, and just open your mind to the possibility that things are not necessarily what they appear, and that's okay. That's okay. And if you look at Taoism, which is the sort of the cornerstone system of both metaphysics and philosophy in the East, in China, right? In China, and also Japanese philosophy, right? The underpinnings of Zen Buddhism is very influenced by Taoism. It's sort of a mix in many ways. And Lao Tzu talks about the way. I don't have the first verse in front of me, but I was just reading a passage. My opening for Homo Mysticus is actually the first verse of the Lao Tzu, the way of virtue, right? The Tao Te Ching. And Ursula Le Guin's translation. Ursula Le Guin's a great fantasy author, Wizard of Earthsea. She's one of my favorite authors. And she is actually taught in school. She's a wonderful writer, like right up there with J.R.R. Tolkien. And she does a translation of the Lao Tzu, of the Way of Virtue, the Tao Te Ching. And of course, her translations are, they're not, precise, accurate translations, but ideologically, she opens up a whole new window. I mean, she's just so brilliant, and it sort of very much fits into, the mindset of the wizards and the world that she created. But so this idea of the way, right, and the flow, right, at a very fundamental level, that is the answer. And if you're sort of, at ease and in harmony with, your own self, right, emotional self, psychic self, and with your external surroundings, whether it's professional, family, right, or these other layers, right, nation state, right, sort of 7 spheres of existence, right. If you can harmonize that, right, you're now, operating at maximum efficiency, right, and certainly you'll feel better because you're sort of in the flow. You're not sort of resisting. But as we shift, all those structures are changing, and that becomes a very difficult task. So that's the update for today. I got to jump into a couple of meetings here. So namaste from Providence, Keep the peace. Notes from the Digital Underground. I'll give you an update in a couple of weeks. Post this probably on TikTok and YouTube. You can check it out. Any questions, hit me up. JuanValdez1971 at gmail.com. And check out those books. You know, they're pretty out there, but they're pretty cool. All right? Peace.